Hello.
You're listening to The Beautiful Idea,
a podcast from a collective of several anarchist and autonomous media producers scattered around the world.
We're bringing you interviews and stories from the front lines of autonomous social movements and struggles, as well as original commentary and analysis.
Follow us on Mastodon and at thebeautifulidea.show.
Thanks for listening.
Welcome back to The Beautiful Idea. On this episode, we speak with several authors and organizers marking 6 months into the second Trump administration coming into power. During our multiple discussions, we look at the recent deployment of the military into Los Angeles, California, the ramping up of ICE raids and arrests across the U.S., and the passing of the Republican so-called Big Beautiful Bill, which earmarks billions for war and the deportation machine while cutting taxes on the ultra-wealthy and corporations, while slashing social services, healthcare, and food assistance for the poor. Already, this has led to some rural hospitals being threatened with closure as food banks struggle to keep up with demand. In this episode, you will hear from Silky Shaw, the executive director of the Detention Watch Network and author of Unbuild Walls, Why Immigrant Justice Needs Abolition from Haymarket Books. Shaw talks about the rapid acceleration of deportations under Trump and the construction of new detention facilities, such as the newly built concentration camp Alligator Alcatraz. Next, we hear from Jessica Pishko, author of The Highest Law in the Land, How the Unchecked Power of Sheriffs Threatens Democracy. Pishko breaks down the interplay between police and ICE, as well as the brutal violence deployed by law enforcement during recent demonstrations in Los Angeles. Next, we hear from Christian Williams, author of Our Enemies in Blue, Police and Power in America, as Christian takes on the role of counterinsurgency in the Trump administration, the weaponization of fascist spectacle, and the growth of conspiracy theories within protest movements. Lastly, we speak with Vicky Osterweil, author of In Defense of Looting and a member of the Collective of Anarchist Writers, or CAW. Vicky breaks down the recently passed Republican budget bill and talks about its potential impact in our communities and ways that we can mobilize to push back. As anger continues to build on the streets, we hope these discussions shine a light on the contours and context of the building social war being waged against poor and working people across the U.S. Thanks for listening. Let's dive right into it.
Hi, my name is Silky Shaw. I'm the executive director of Detention Watch Network. I also wrote a book called Unbuild Walls that came out last year from Haymarket Books. And a lot of the work we do at Detention Watch Network is trying to limit the expansion of immigration detention in the United States. We don't believe anybody should be detained for their immigration status. And we do that through grassroots organizing and advocacy and a lot of work around narrative. And so that's kind of the approach we're taking. Thanks for having me.
Hi, I'm Jessica Pishko. I'm the author of a book called The Highest Law in the Land, How the Unchecked Power of Sheriffs Threatens Democracy. I'm also a lawyer. So in the past, I've done some criminal system style reform work. Right now, I'm mostly a journalist, do a lot of reporting on local law enforcement and some reporting on the intersection with the far right.
Great, and we want to talk about all that. And the reason we wanted to talk to both of you in a group setting is because so much of the current moment seems to be defined by the interplay between ICE, DHS, and then also other segments of law enforcement through things like 287G agreements to everything that's happening. And also there's a lot of misinformation out. A lot of people are convinced that a lot of ICE agents are undercover Proud Boys. So we kind of want to unpack all that. But I just want to start by asking, because I've listened to and seen stuff that both of y'all put out. And Silky, I remember you did a great interview with No Borders Media about before Trump came into office. I just want to ask both of you, what squares up with kind of your original thoughts about the administration to where we are now? Just big picture stuff. What are you seeing? What's different than you thought it might look like? And just any thoughts you have in general?
I guess I could start. I think that in some ways there was a lot of scenario planning that happened last year to sort of imagine, okay, what is this going to look like? And I think some of the things are definitely happening that we imagine, which includes the expansion of detention and the sort of more, quote unquote traditional forms of detention, for lack of a better framing, which includes expansion of the private prison industry, the use of more and more county jails, the use of what they've deemed quote unquote soft-sided facilities, and just expansion at sort of every level and doing everything they can to kind of detain more people. We are now officially at 56,000 people in detention, which is the highest it's ever been. The last time we were close to this was in 2019 with 55,000 people in detention. And then trying to kind of go after sanctuary cities and expanding on raids, like all of that stuff is stuff we expected. I think the things that are a sort of jumping of scale or, departure are the sort of, the connection between detention and the like suppression of dissent, and specifically the targeting of students who had protested in solidarity with Palestine or expressed solidarity with Palestine in some form, being detained. And so seeing this kind of move towards using detention as a weapon in their authoritarianism and their fascism. And so seeing how that played out, particularly with Mahmoud Khalil, who, amazingly was released recently, which is really good news. But I think that how that started to play out was one of the departures and concerns, and sort of having this system build up over 40 plus years now being used in this way. And similarly, I think, the other really alarming thing is the sort of offshoring of detention that we've seen, particularly in El Salvador, and the use of CCOT, the federal prison there. But I think from my perspective, like so much of the narrative has been about how people are being denied due process over and over again. But the reality is that like immigrants have been denied due process for many, many years now in the US. And so that, like what we're seeing now is sort of an extension of that. It's building on that. And similarly, immigrants have been transferred to detention centers far away, making it harder for them to fight their cases, making it more isolated, making it more likely that they're kind of give up and say, I'm fine being deported. And similarly, I think this sort of offshoring of detention, which is new in the context of the US in terms of people who currently live here being shipped away, but is something we've seen in countries in other parts of the world, including Australia and Israel and Denmark and other places. And so I think there's both, there are things that are changing and shifting in ways that we're trying to understand. And is it a shift that's going to be permanent is the real question. But sort of understanding that in a global context, I think is important in terms of how we approach fighting back.
Yeah, I mean, I think that like Silky, I was not thinking as much about this offshoring of people that were going to get sent away. So, CCOT, I admit, was not necessarily on my radar at the time. I was thinking about what might happen, once Donald Trump became president. I think, I was pretty aware that Tom Homan, who is a person I have tracked, and Stephen Miller for some time, that they had been spending the last 4 years sort of building up a network that included a lot of local law enforcement. And so what I did expect to see was like a great deal of mobilization of local law enforcement, including, as we've seen, not just sheriffs, but also local police, state police. And I think, at least in Florida, we've seen a number of even university police getting co-opted into doing forms of immigration arrest and detention. So that I expected. I did have, before, I was going to say, since October 7th, law enforcement has been extremely concerned about, people who are involved in the Palestinian solidarity movement. I do think that this, whatever we want to call it with Iran, war with Iran has definitely amped that up, right? Because we're starting to see the national security narrative coming back, that like we need to be concerned about immigration for national security reasons. I will confess that the thing that happened faster than I thought was the implementation of 287G task force agreements, which we can get more into. But these task force agreements, which basically allow local law enforcement to act like ICE agents. Most importantly, it means that they can arrest people that they think might be deportable using only detainers and sometimes without any kind of warrant. I did not think that this would happen as quickly. It did not happen under Trump 1. And I do think like that happened very quickly in places like Florida. It's really like the primary mode of policing at the moment. And so I do, that was something that I thought might happen, but really got cranked up very fast.
The next question I wanted to ask is just in terms of like logistics, because I think a big question before all this kicked off was just like, what would they be able to do logistically? And now we've seen that. And Silky, you were talking about just the amount of people in detention now, and we'll talk a little more about sort of like the big projects they have planned, like the so-called Alligator Alcatraz in Florida. I guess my question is like, when you see the ramping up, like when Stephen Miller's saying like we want 3,000 people per day, we want to go after people at Home Depots, like do you think can they basically continue this level of action? And also, how does that play into like the money question? I know there's been some reporting about like they're racking up all these debts. Is that tied into whether or not the budget bill gets passed? Like in terms of like logistical capacity, what are you all seeing?
I mean, I'm curious what Jess has to say about this, but I mean, I'll just say like, they are coming like, so everything Jess was saying, like the way that ICE operates, and I think that one of the challenges of this kind of like squarely being focused on ICE versus sort of like the broader infrastructure of law enforcement is that like they are able to do this because they work really closely with law enforcement across the country and local law enforcement, including sheriffs and local police departments and state police and, in places like Texas state troopers and just beyond, there's just a lot of, collaboration across the board. And I think because there are particular states that have really strong sanctuary law, it's been harder for them to funnel people into the system as quickly because they're not necessarily working as closely with law enforcement like in California and Oregon or Illinois or elsewhere. And so then this sort of spectacle of moving towards these really public, like raids that kind of instill fear in community is their strategy. So I think in terms of the strategy of trying to both put people in fear and round up people sort of indiscriminately, it's working. Like in that sense, like they are succeeding and kind of like putting people into the shadows and that kind of thing. But in terms of their actually ability to bring in those numbers into the detention system and deportation pipeline, it's still quite limited because, when this has worked really successfully, it's been when there's been a lot of people being funneled through the criminal legal system and all of these programs that sort of like ramp up racial profiling and et cetera. And I think it remains to be seen. And I do think that that's like, they're responding to so many years of wins on sanctuary policy. And the thing to remind everybody is that like a lot of those wins, a lot of that push on sanctuary policy grew and was like sort of flourished under the Obama era. And like when, like it was kind of possible to do that stuff because people were responding to both mass deportations under Obama and really understanding the criminal legal system better because of the Black Lives Matter movement. And so now this is just a response to that. Like we've gotten wins and now they're sort of responding to that in this way. But I do think what Jess was saying about this, the 287G like task force model being implemented, I think before it wasn't necessarily true that most people came into the system because of 287G. Like it was implemented and it was used and a lot of people were coming in. But at the same time, it was really like having ICE agents at county jails and having that collaboration there that actually funneled a lot of people into the system and having the like data strategies like secure communities. And so now when there's just so much more incentive from this administration to kind of let these agents and let these, law enforcement officers, police sort of like focus on this, I think there is a real question of how far it could go. On the money piece, the quick thing I would just say is that, you know, this is what we saw during the Trump's first, 4 years in office, was that ICE would do this thing where they would like overspend their money and then make the case to Congress that they needed more money because, oh, now our detention system is at 45,000 and, oh, we have to they both bailed them out. And then they would sort of ratchet and say, hey, actually, look, we're using detention even more. We need even more money. And so that's the way they brought up the numbers on detention every year for a few years. I think that this budget bill is really kind of like a blank check in so many ways. I mean, 45 billion for detention over the next 4 years. It's so much more money. It's 13 times the amount of money that ICE gets for detention annually. And I think the potential for that is really scary to think about. But I do think logistically, there are real questions on how quickly they could ramp this stuff up. The harm that's going to happen, staffing questions, I think, are there as well. So I think all of that stuff will be in the mix.
Yeah, I think, the limit in general to any kind of policing and jailing is going to be capacity. And as Silky pointed out, right, they are at, kind of record numbers. And it's plain that, capacity, where to hold people is an issue, which is one reason why I think they started to do these rapid track deportations, right? So they're dismissing, I know you know about this bill, right? They're dismissing ongoing court cases and then rearresting them to sort of fast track their deportations because they have, the root of the problem, honestly, is if you're policing and jailing, you run out of jail space at some point everywhere. No matter, even if you spend money or put up soft-sided, whatever, you put up tents or whatever, you're just going to run out of space. And so I do think one of the things we see is with going through a variety of legal strategies that appear designed to one, deport people as fast as they can with kind of not wanting people to notice. One thing seems to be this, they don't want people to know or see how many people there are or where they're going. There's sort of this issue of disappearing people. We sort of don't know where they are. And they're using kind of tricky legal techniques, dismissing cases to rearrest people. In San Diego, when they arrested, I forgot the name of the restaurant, but they arrested a group of people at a restaurant. One of the tricks they've been doing is using search warrants for criminal cases. So they'll come and say, we have a search warrant for a criminal case that might be money laundering or drugs or producing false IDs or something. And they use that search warrant as a pretext to enter a space and then arrest anyone they think is an immigrant, right? So they're going in, they're because they're pretextually entering on a criminal investigation, and then they're going to arrest 100 people. And so, right, we see these sort of legal tricks. The other legal trick, of course, is what I would call they're basically creating criminals. So canceling people's status. Prior to when Trump took office, most deportations in the interior, so not talking about at the border, they happened when people were arrested and charged or tried with crimes, mostly what people would describe as quote unquote violent crimes, right? So the thing is, folks who were accused or convicted of things homicides or serious assaults, etc., those people are routinely been turned over to ICE and deported. That's the thing I think people need to see is that has always happened. Now, it usually happens in the back end at jails and prisons, so people don't see it, right? The people are just turned over to ICE and nobody really pays that much attention. And we even know that most people deported that way are usually folks who've been convicted of multiple instances of driving while intoxicated, which I bring up to say that there just are not people walking around who have been charged with quote unquote serious, we don't have them. And so because they're saying these are the people they're arresting, but it's just not true. And so they're producing new criminals, right? And so you see the rhetoric changing. Now they're oh, well, just being here is in some way breaking the law. Or if you get a job, you're breaking the law. They'll sort of talk about well, everybody's just breaking the law all the time. So it doesn't really matter. Whereas in previous regimes, right, the focus was always on folks that were accused of some sort of crime that was deemed to be violent. And that's why I think like it's sort of connected, right? Because that was allowed to go on kind of unremarked upon for a very long time. It was, like I said, it was not happening in the light of day. And now we have these really alarming raids that are happening in the light of day that do look, I mean, they are plainly being used to punish places with like sanctuary policies, which, as Silky points out, was a big win, right? It was in response to the sort of connectedness of local law enforcement and ICE, and people implemented these policies to try to prevent that. And of course, they were never perfect. And so I think like what we see is like the strain of sanctuary policies, not just the desire to destroy sanctuary policies completely, which I think is like the ultimate goal that Stephen Miller has, but also to strain them, right? So we have like the LAPD blocking roads so ICE can drive or something like that, right? Which, feels like, well, they're assisting, this is all assisting ICE. But I think it also just goes to show that like the systems are kind of inextricably intertwined, both in terms of like where people are detained and held, and then also how people like get arrested, right? It's sort of like one big system.
Yeah, I want to ask you, Jessica, about Los Angeles here in a second, but Silky, I have one more question I want to put to you, sort of like specifically looking at immigration. When you see Trump sort of like doing this one step forward, one step back thing around getting pressure from like agricultural production heads and stuff, saying that they're not going to go after people working in the fields or at hotels, like what do you make of that? Either what Trump is saying or in terms of policy, like what are you seeing? Like, are they sort of acquiescing to those demands, or are they just trying to make people that support them feel better, or what are they actually doing?
I mean, that's a good question. I think that they are, I mean, this is kind of like the daily news with Trump, right? It's kind of like whatever's happening, what's the way to stay in the news? What's the way to kind of like advance this agenda, but then also understand the like, they are having to respond to the fact that actually like the lie they're telling everyone, which is what Jessica was just talking about, which is like immigration is a public safety issue. It's a national security issue. We're dealing with, like this is a huge problem, and this is what immigration is. And that's like a lie that's been sort of exacerbated for years, and a lot of the reason why we are at this point. But then the truth is that immigration is like the kind of central thing is that immigration is about labor and of course about seeking refuge and family and all the other things. But I think this tension is that, the like number of stories, and this is like the media kind of like is so excited to find these stories, right? Of like, oh, this person voted for Trump and they didn't realize they were going to lose their coworker, or this family member, or this other person just like realizing sort of the impact that these policies have. So I think my sense is like what the Trump administration is trying to do is appease and say, oh, we're not going to go after people at these work sites, which is so public, but still they're going to continue to be doing the like targeting on the streets or in homes or at airports or at ports of entry, like all the other places that actually, or at, Greyhound and Amtrak, like wherever, all the other different places where actually like ICE has like jurisdiction to kind of like engage. And obviously they've been targeting people at courthouses and hospitals and other places. So I don't know. I think at some level, it's just a lot of like rhetoric and just to try to seem like they're, and it's sort of wild because it was like, oh, we're not going to go after farm workers. We're not going to go after, hotel workers or like restaurant workers, or it just seemed like actually a very ridiculously large category of people. And you're just like, no, that's actually just not true. That's not really what's going to happen. And it was a way to keep, business community on their side, I guess. But I think all these things are still happening. It's just happening in maybe a different way. And that's not even necessarily true. I mean, the raids are still continuing. They'll have like another round of raids. So I think for all that stuff, I mean, usually it's just kind of a blip in a moment of like Trump saying something, and then we'll sort of see how these things evolve. I do think that the escalations recently are kind of, probably giving them pause to some degree, but, at the same time, they're moving forward with so much else. And the Supreme Court just ruled that it's fine to deport people or basically traffic people to other countries where they've never been to. So, they're also like, they have more room to do the things that they want to do. But, to Jessica's point, like, I think so much of this is about the fact that for years, this sort of good immigrant versus bad immigrant frame lent itself to that sort of perception that there were people who, as Jessica pointed out, on the streets who were, a public safety threat, quote unquote. And therefore, that's what the role of immigration was to target those people, immigration enforcement. But the reality is that sort of, capitulation from President Obama, from Clinton before him, from the Biden administration, just gave more fodder to the Republicans, and they were able to kind of expand this lie around public safety and national security. And we got to the point where it was not just the good immigrant versus bad immigrant, but like basically all immigrants are bad now. And now they're having to kind of negotiate that because of the contradiction of the US, which is a country that has forever been about migration, whether it was forced migration or what we see now in different ways in terms of root causes. But I think it like functions on that, and it ultimately is trying to kind of really commit to the idea of whiteness. And so there's this like constant contradiction that they're negotiating. And so I think that's part of the reason why we're seeing those statements from Trump.
Yeah, and to kind of add on, I do think this reflects like a fissure on the right, just as like a general philosophical matter. So like, just from what I've seen. So like Stephen Miller, a lot of scholars at some right-wing think tanks, like the Claremont Institute, I mean, genuinely, they want like no immigrants ever, none. Like, doesn't matter how, I guess it doesn't matter when they came. Like, they don't want anyone who, it's like pure just white nationalism, like an ethno state is what they envision. And so this is, they sort of, I think as a result, like the policies push towards that, right? Like you see Stephen Miller pushing to attempt to arrest and expel as many people as he can sort of like quasi legally justify, right? It's sort of like have to have sort of a plausible legal argument. They're sort of pushing it, and then people push back because I also think like a large segment of the right and the left have, as like Silky calls like the good immigrant model, which is like people who are going to work, like the ones where people are like, I guess the stories of the folks like, I didn't think it would be me, right? The people that we sort of say, oh, they came and they're working and they're honest and their kids are in the military and this sort of thing, right? The sort of like American dream. But I do think like a segment of people who helped get Trump elected are genuinely like, they don't care about that. And so what I think we see is them sort of fighting a little bit about like, how exactly do they want to define it? Now, the net result is like bad for everybody, right? Kind of doesn't matter. may or may not matter. Like the net result is extremely bad. But I also think that's why we'll get like not farm workers, even though the day of they, I think, went and arrested farm workers in like Nebraska. I mean, there's a bunch of stuff also happening in places where people just simply aren't there's not as much media, right? So like farms or agricultural workers, like places in the Midwest where there just aren't as many reporters. And so they're just not reported as widely. But as far as I can tell, they are happening, whatever that thing meant, whatever this no farmer workers or hotel workers means.
Yeah, and Trump seems to have gone back and forth on that as well. But Jessica, I wanted to ask you, like, when you've seen things play out in Los Angeles, I mean, we even saw one instance of the police and the sheriffs ended up shooting each other in some like sort of crossfire and all this. When we saw the military and ICE on the streets, like what are you seeing play out? Like using Los Angeles sort of as this test subject, if that is something that Trump wants to replicate in other big cities, what have you seen in terms of law enforcement in their interactions with the National Guard, the Marines, and ICE? Because it seems like one of the most scary possibilities is regular law enforcement, even in sanctuary cities and states, being used to essentially subdue and attack protesters and communities to basically aid ICE and DHS enforcement. Same thing with the National Guard, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I think that so Los Angeles is kind of an interesting place because one, they have a lot of people who are immigrants, right? They have a very like robust immigrant community. That's a lot of people who live here. They also had a very robust like Black Lives Matter movement, a lot of movements for police accountability, right? So it's like a place where people are like very active in these movements. And I think that that's a reason why we saw a lot of protests and a lot of different kinds of protests, right? Because you could activate people more quickly. The other thing about Los Angeles, though, is like, honestly, they just have a lot of police. Like part of it is just, if you have so many police that they're shooting each other, then you just have too many police around. And I think it's an interesting place because the other thing about Los Angeles, right, is that it is in California and it is a place where they have sanctuary laws. And in short, the sanctuary laws there mean that local law enforcement are not supposed to, quote, like cooperate with ICE. What that usually means is they won't enter into agreements with ICE, so no 287G agreements. But it's also supposed to mean that they don't, for example, like turn people over to ICE. Now, the truth is they do sometimes, right? And again, a lot of it happens sort of behind the jail wall where people can't see, right? But we know that in Los Angeles, like people do get turned over to ICE sometimes, usually because like a jailer calls and says, this person is probably deportable. So we know it kind of happens. But I think that what happened was, in some ways, I'm not much of a like police apologist, but in some ways, like they are being pressured, like, the many groups and organizations like police associations and sheriff associations are telling their law enforcement members, if you don't sign up for 287G, like Donald Trump will send ICE to your city and do what he did to LA. And I will say, like, it is, if you are the LA police chief, like I actually believe that the LA police chief does not want to be helping ICE. It's, it's bad for his image. He doesn't like it. It's honestly like time and money and just like a pain. Now, the other thing police don't like is they don't like protests, right? We learned this from 2020, right? They don't like protests, and protests are annoying and upsetting. In particular, protests that are against the police, right? Any protest that is sort of like opposed to police presence or opposed to police violence, police take very personally. And so they are called in to do what kind of basically like crowd control. And even if the police chief isn't excited about cooperating with ICE, right, he ends up inadvertently doing it because the truth is it's pretty hard for him to pull back and do nothing. I also think that's not what his rank and file want to do. So I do think we also have to think about like the politics of rank and file police vis-a-vis the politics of like a police chief, which is to say, like what I have seen is like the politics of rank and file law enforcement are very, very pro-Trump. And for a lot of law enforcement, Border Patrol, ICE, like one, they see themselves united in a sort of like policely brotherhood, right? Like they see themselves all as allies and they are pretty pro MAGA. And so the idea of arresting people who are protesting ICE vis-a-vis arresting, immigrants, it's like it all kind of, I think, jives with their ideology. I mean, I will say that like there's no police association out there. They have talked many a time about not liking protesters, but they have not said anything about the fact that this is ICE or DHS or FBI agents who are causing the chaos, right? Like the chaos didn't erupt spontaneously. It occurred because ICE and federal agents came to Los Angeles to conduct, kind of basically, massively alarming and unnecessary raids. So I think it's like I said, you have not seen police saying like, hey, could you stop these raids? Maybe they are behind closed doors, but instead like what they feel instead, which I sort of attribute to like I said, their sort of feelings about 2020 and the, Black Lives Matter movement, like they have residual irritation at protesters. And so they don't really, it is just a thing that they got very mad at. I mean, it's hard to imagine, but I mean, literally, I just think it's like their feelings about protesters are just really negative. When they see protesters, they get very, very upset.
I just wanted to ask, one hopefully positive question. I mean, there is a lot of activation right now. People are doing everything from mutual aid programs of like going out and picking up groceries for people that are afraid to go outside. There's rapid response networks. We've had Homan make several statements about how much these things are impacting ICE's logistical abilities. I don't know. I'm just curious from you all, like, what do you see as some bright spots or things that could be expanded, or just thoughts in general about how grassroots campaigns and organizing is having an impact? Anything that you want to talk about on that?
I mean, I think, it's always a confusing time because things are no question getting worse in terms of the expansion of detention and what we're seeing and sort of how it is, like I said earlier, a testing ground for authoritarianism, essentially, like detention being used in this particular way, and then also just doing what it's done for many years now and expanding that. I think especially it's really hard to see how much worse the conditions in detention are getting. It's quite severe in terms of treatment and also like getting food, getting like, people are just in really dire conditions. People are being held in field offices for long periods of time. Like, it's wild, but there's a lot of attention, and we're seeing, we at Detention Watch Network, we have a campaign called Communities Not Cages, where we basically work with people across the country who are trying to either call attention to a local detention center and try to shut it down, which obviously is sort of harder in these conditions, but we have been successful. I mean, I think that was the thing, like they're, as Jessica brought up, 2020, like the culmination of that actually opened up a lot of space for us. And I can't tell you, for years, I have been working on against immigration detention for more than 20 years now. And I would just spend years just losing campaigns. We would lose constantly. And then, but we were building up and we were still trying and we were building that base. And then once 2020 came along, we were actually really, really ready to go. And more than 20 detention centers are no longer in use because of a lot of those campaigns in those years leading up to 2020 and after, including from like local and state level and also federal level officials. And so I think that's something to hold on to now, which is, there's, 15, 20 places that we're working with organizers on the ground from, Florida to Kansas to New Jersey to Louisiana, like across the country, where people are really fighting back against detention expansion or trying to call attention to a facility. You see more elected officials like Mayor Ras Baraka in New Jersey and Newark. You see more members of Congress doing unannounced sort of like oversight visits to detention centers. And those are all opportunities to get more people to engage. Like, detention is in the daily news again. And I think that, when I think about doing this work over many years, it was something that was so hidden. People didn't know it. People didn't understand it. Thought about it as this like thing in the shadows, as like an aside, but actually now it's sort of like become this sort of bigger thing that people are paying attention to, which gives us opportunity to make the case. I think that's, from my perspective, like, we have to hold on to that and bring people into the fight, because at some point we're going to have another opportunity like 2020. We're going to have openings to make the case and have bold action be taken to actually shut down facilities, to move away from mass detention. And this is the time to sort of prepare for that. So yeah, that's kind of what I would offer. I hold on to that. I hold on to the fact that Mahmoud Khalil was finally released, that, these things are starting to shift and we can kind of build from there.
Yeah, I mean, I think Silky's probably being a little modest about her accomplishments. I feel like it must be mentioned. But I do, one of the things that concerns me is that a lot of this is happening like, yeah, it's sort of one, rising authoritarianism, but also this sort of like issue of kind of like AI slop, which is just not a thing I pay that much attention to before, but now it's sort of in your face, right? Bad information, AI slop. And also I think like an erosion of local sovereignty. Like, one of the things I think is not going remarked upon as much as maybe it could be, in my view, is that one of the Trump administration's goals is to erode local sovereignty, right? Like the arresting of Monica McIvers, attempted arresting of the New York mayor, right? These are places where, in essence, like there has been success, right? Like the truth is, maybe it's not as much success as maybe I might wish for, but like there have been successes in people trying to have successful campaigns, and electing officials that don't want to cooperate with ICE. And like, so that success in and of itself has become, I think, an issue kind of like local democracy. So, I mean, that said, I do think like that is where I see one of the spaces, very similar to what Silky said, is that people can participate in local democracy. They can get involved. They can, at least for your local law enforcement, if we know local law enforcement is participating, we know that people might have to build detention centers, but those are things people can oppose locally. I also encourage, another space I think is to look at the use of surveillance systems like Flock, which I think are going to increasingly get used for all sorts of things, right? So it's sort of like a general policy of reducing the size and scope of the police, which is something everyone can do, right, at their local level. Like people, you see, I think, what happens in Los Angeles, and it feels like there isn't anything you can do. Right? People feel kind of helpless, but you can do stuff like where you live, which is where I would encourage people to focus. Like, how can you try to like reduce the size and scope of your law enforcement where you live? And I also think that sometimes like wins might not look as the wins are there, but they may not look as like winny as we would wish, So like the release of Mahmoud Khalil is one that I would also point to say like that's a win. We wish it was more people, but it is a win. In where I live in North Carolina, they have delayed. Advocates here not only delayed bills that would require law enforcement cooperation with ICE, but the governor did veto a bill that would make it worse. So like, delay is a win. Like if you can get people not to vote on a bill, that's good. If you can get the governor to veto a bill, that's a win too. So like, I think maybe we have to think about those wins as like cumulative, even though I admit it's really hard when you see like videos from Los Angeles. And so I appreciate like why people see it and feel, I think, very upset and angry, and also kind of helpless.
Yeah. One thing to add on to what Jessica was saying and thinking about like from my perspective, so much incredible organizing is happening, especially in the South, where actually there isn't, this sort of perception that your elected officials are like elected officials aren't supportive of the strategy or sanctuary policy or other things, but people are figuring out different ways to organize. And I think North Carolina is a really good example. There's an organization there called Siembra NC that has this defend and recruit tool that is, like helping communities sort of figure out how they interrupt the process of somebody being put into ICE custody and making sure to like build up that support locally. And I just think that, there's like, I just 100% agree with what Jessica's saying. Like this is the time to go local. We do have a lot of power at the local level, and also like building up community support and thinking about how to support immigrants helps like so many other people. It's not just immigrants that are being criminalized. It's not, it's people who are seeking abortions. It's trans people. It goes beyond that. And I think really understanding the role that both ICE, but also law enforcement generally is playing in like Trump's agenda, I think is so key. And that happens at the local level. So I would recommend that tool as something to check out.
Well, before we sign off, again, I just want to plug both your books. I encourage people to check out Silky's book, Unbuilt Walls, While Immigrant Justice Needs Abolition, and Jessica's book, The Highest Law in the Land, How Unchecked Power of Sheriffs Threatens Democracy. Check them both out at a local bookstore near you or online. Just in closing, I wanted to ask you all, like, what are some things that you are looking at? Like, what should organizers on the ground and people watching these things, the intersections of law enforcement and the deportation machine, what should we all be looking out for? I mean, there's so much we didn't get a chance to cover. We need a couple more hours, but what are some things that are on your radar that you would also encourage people to be looking at?
I think that one of the things, I think that what we see happening a lot is, like I said, in addition to sort of eroding this local democracy, is what I would call like legalish tactics. Like one of the things that the anti-immigrant movement has done and is doing is moving on multiple levels. So like doing these ICE raids, pulling people's tax returns, using Flock or other data management, generating like search warrants to enter places, right? This is something I could see proliferating, is like basically generating a search warrant to search someone's home or a facility for something and using that as like a pretext to arrest people. I also think they're going to start doing like legalish arguments to destroy sanctuary city laws. So like, I guess the thing I would say is like, there's like sort of multiple fronts that they're working on. And a lot of it is, it's not totally legal. Like it's plain that the goal is to like push, this discretion in the law as much as it is. The immigration system has always been really discretionary. There's wide discretion for people. And we now see that the problem with that wide discretion is that in the hands of a bad actor or an authoritarian actor, that discretion can be used for like immense damage. So I also hope people think about that, like when it becomes time to kind of like consider rebuilding.
Yeah, I would just kind of adding on to that. I 100% agree. And I also think sometimes there is this kind of way that our way of kind of like taking in this information is to look at how SCOTUS, like Supreme Court's responding, or this litigation or these legal strategies, and like what is able to be done on those fronts. But I think there is a sort of, not really fully understanding the infrastructure questions, because like the way they do this is by having the infrastructure. They can have like all the surveillance in the world. They can have all the like laws in the books and whatever. But if they, if they have the money and the infrastructure, then they can carry these things out. And I think looking locally, Florida is expanding detention in all these really, really disturbing ways, both at county jails and also, as you mentioned earlier, this, sort of makeshift facility in the Everglades called Alligator Alcatraz, which they dubbed Alligator Alcatraz, which is wild.
It's totally like, because Trump mentioned Alcatraz.
Right.
And they're like, this is a cool idea.
But like, that's the thing. I think there's this way that, we get really caught up in these like very specific cases, but like, again, it's about the infrastructure. It's about having these county jails have these intergovernmental service agreements. It's about having more private prison contracts. It's about the expansion of these facilities. It's about having more money for Border Patrol agents and ICE agents. And that all, like this bill that could potentially pass as soon as next week is just going to give them so much more money for all of that. But there's still, again, they don't, like those things don't have to move. It's not a done deal then. Like there's still ways to stop the infrastructure locally. I know there's like already people who are trying to intervene around environmental protections in the Alligator Alcatraz case. And yeah, so I think it's important for us to kind of just recognize that like it's both how these like things are shifting legally and how it impacts an individual, but also how the infrastructure is just going to impact more and more people. And what we've seen time and time again is that when you have detention capacity in a certain area, there's just more likely a chance that people in that area are going to be targeted for deportation.
Real quick, where can people follow your work at and find out more?
We're at detentionwatchnetwork.org, and I'm on Blue Sky and Instagram at SilkyS13 and also at Detention Watch to find more information.
And I'm on Blue Sky, Jess Pish, just JESSPISH. And I have a Substack that's sheriffs.substack.com, where I irregularly post. And I do think I want to make a plug for Silky's organization. Like, if you are in an area where people are talking about building new jails, like, I know states are setting aside money for this. Like, I do really encourage you to check out the resources on their site, because that is the thing that like people can get, that is a thing you can fight locally.
name's Christian Williams. I'm a writer living in Portland, Oregon. Probably best known for my book, Our Enemies in Blue, Police and Power in America, which is a history of the municipal police in the United States.
Well, thank you so much for joining us. And we've talked in the past about counterinsurgency, about the police. And I think a lot of people recently listened to your interview on the Outlaw podcast, and it was a welcome dose of reality and hit a lot of points that we've been talking about as well, just about in terms of counterinsurgency and the weaponization of spectacle in a lot of ways. But I kind of wanted to just use that as a starting point today. But I don't know, we're going to ask some of the other guests this later that we're talking to, but how does sort of like your assumptions of what's going on with the Trump administration and everything with DHS, the police, how does that vibe with what we see now? Like, are there things that stand out that maybe you thought like are running differently or worse, or I don't know?
There are a number of things that are distinctive about this particular moment. And I mean, one of the things that stands out and also makes the discussion hard is just separating the signal from the noise, right? Like there's so much happening all the time. And there's also this Trump personally is very good at creating this like aura of uncertainty around everything that is happening, because it's never exactly clear what his policy is or what his plans are, right? And and some of that is his tendency to try to kind of like govern through the internet, that he will post something on social media that says like, we're definitely going to do something. And then like, maybe that's policy or maybe it's not. Maybe it's just an idea that he had. Maybe nothing comes of it. It's hard to know. I mean, we saw this similarly in the recent attacks on Iran, where, different representatives of different parts of the administration were giving diametrically opposed answers to like very straightforward questions like, is the U.S. going to attack Iran? Right? We've seen similar kind of chaos around tariffs. Like it's hard to know, especially from just sort of like a news consumer point of view, like which tariffs are in effect, how much they are, what their aims are, any of that. And we see something similar with immigration enforcement and policing and that sort of thing. So one thing that I think is distinctive of this moment is just the sense of chaos around all of that. That said, there are definitely some things that do stand out to me. I mean, the thing that got everybody's attention, of course, was Trump taking control of the California National Guard, sending it into LA, and then also sending a detachment of Marines. It's hard to say how much of that was intended as like an actual enforcement operation and how much of that was just him positioning himself in this way of like showing that he could do it, right? Like that he wanted the image of mobilizing the military against demonstrations in a Democrat-controlled city in a Democrat-controlled state. It seems that, in reality, the heavy lifting of attacking the demonstrations was still mostly being done by the LAPD and the LA County Sheriff. And in a way, we see a repeat of some of the dynamics that occurred in Portland in 2020 around the George Floyd uprising, where the local cops had been attacking demonstrations for weeks. As soon as the federal authorities got involved, it became a national story. And then we saw local politicians who were perfectly happy when it was the local cops doing it, expressing outrage and, being shocked that the feds would be intervening in this way. So we see some of that same hustle over who is responsible for policing playing out in a similar kind of way, where like there's a bipartisan agreement among mayors and the president that the demonstrations need to be attacked. But they have kind of a turf war over who's responsible for it.
Yeah, I mean, that in itself is really interesting. And I think that's a question for social movements. Like, how do we break out of that bubble? Like you said, it almost seems like the sort of like 2020 timeline happened over the course of like 2 weeks, where it's just like you said, like all of a sudden we're the media story, which I don't think is, I mean, I think that's essentially by design, or maybe better put, like, those are the limits imposed by the pundits and like the media class, that suddenly this becomes a discussion on who has the legitimacy to carry out, potentially deadly force against people that are literally responding to their family members being taken by federal troops and like put in this dungeon essentially.
Right.
And it just like it, Karen Bass and Newsom are presented on one side and then Trump is on the other. And, there's this attempt to kind of like paint the Democrats as sort of like these like more caring, paternalistic types. But in reality, they're, like you said, they're the ones bringing in the police that are shooting people night after night, attacking journalists, helping, the state carry out these operations. I don't know. It just seems, obviously a very small window into what's actually going on, of course.
Yeah. And and some of this is the tendency of the media to view things not only in kind of binaries, but in specifically partisan binaries, right? And so it's an easier story to tell that Gavin Newsom is bravely standing up to Trump, because that's the kind of binary opposition that media storytelling is comfortable working with. It's much harder to present a story where on the one hand, it's people in the community, and on the other hand, they're opposed to government at sort of all levels, but there's an internal division within the state about where exactly the authority lies, right? And all of that is to say that it seems important that Trump wanted to make this gesture of, basically having a military occupation of an American city in response to some militant, but not especially widespread protests. But I don't know that it did very much to change the way policing was actually happening at the site, right? At the site of the resistance.
I think the other side of that is that what's interesting is that coming out of Los Angeles, I mean, if we like posit polling data as this, real important thing, which I don't know, I mean, I guess that's up for debate, but I mean, it does seem like coming out of that, there are more people opposed to sending the military against demonstrations, and like the draconian masked up people rounding up folks at Home Depots and like just working class people. That seems to be souring on a lot of people, including a lot of Latino folks.
Yeah.
Maybe people that voted for Trump because he thought that he was going to bring down grocery prices or something. That seems to really be putting people off. So I think there's a question of like, will this, as in the case of Portland, where you had federal troops coming in, I mean, that turned like basically a whole section of the city against what was happening. Is that having the same effect? And I guess, in doing so, will that basically be more of a problem for the state than sort of kind of what they wanted, which is just to, spread fear and like, ooh, the government's bringing like the National Guard in, as if that hasn't happened all the time already.
This is a more complicated question than it probably should be. Under a normal administration, that kind of overreach, which then has that kind of blowback, which is like, allows the Democratic Party to seize a kind of like a moral mantle that they really don't deserve, and leads to increased attention and increased opposition to the underlying policies, those having to do with the deportations that people were reacting to. Like, all of that would just be viewed as like a political blunder, right? And it's the kind of thing that, would in normal times result in backpedaling and an attempt to sort of regain some legitimacy and public support. Under Trump, it's not clear that it will. And there's this paradox about the man personally that makes it very hard to predict what he's going to do, which is, on the one side, he seems very devoted to demonstrating that he can do anything he wants, no matter who opposes it. And on the other side, he has a pathological need to be adored. And how those things fit together in a single personality, I do not understand. but it makes it very hard to know how he's going to react to opposition. And it especially makes it hard to know how he's going to react to opposition within, his fan base, right? So as people who were originally sort of part of the MAGA coalition become disenchanted with various of his policies, it's hard to predict whether the result of that is going to be that he reverses course on the policy and probably just pretends like that was the new policy was his policy all along. We've always been at war with Oceania, or whether he just doubles down and pretends like he's doing something to help the very people who he's attacking, right? So it's hard to tell whether there is some underlying strategy, because the tactics and even the policies are so erratic and are so prone to change sort of moment to moment.
Yeah, well, I think that's probably the strategy right there. It's just like, the chaos is the strategy, and it's just, people have used this metaphor like raptors testing the fences type thing. And it seems like sort of like what shakes out through that, whatever sort of gets them more power, pushes their narrative forward, the wounds they can inflict on people. I mean, like their goal right now is to just deport thousands and thousands of people per day.
Right.
And I don't know if they're hitting those numbers, but they're certainly, doing things they weren't before.
And so in terms of things that are new about this moment, the deportations themselves aren't really new. The nabbing people in a home depot parking lot, that's not really new. A lot of that is just like how ICE has immigration and customs enforcement, how they behave ordinarily. It's just happening more visibly at the moment and kind of everywhere at once. But the thing that is new is the way that they are basically rendering people illegal and then enforcing the law, right? So it's not just that they're going like what they said, and was that they were going to go after the worst of the worst. They were going to go after, criminal aliens, and then they, would tacitly admit that really they meant, all undocumented people, and then push on that, really. If you paid attention to the things that J.D. Vance was saying before the election, we should have known this was coming, because he would consistently refer to asylum seekers as illegal immigrants. And if it was pointed out that seeking asylum is, in fact, the legal process, he would say, well, I don't think it should be. So because I think it should be illegal, they're illegal immigrants, which was just openly signaling that the move was going to be to strip people of their status and then treat them as though they were here illegally. And so we're seeing, people who have green cards being deported, people who were seeking asylum, people who were under protective orders having their legal status removed for the sake of rendering them illegal so that they can be deported. And Stephen Miller has said recently that, of course, that was the plan all along. He's like, well, I mean, you can start with the worst of the worst, but when they're gone, then there's everybody else. So that attack on lawful immigration and that attack on the status of people who had previously been here legally or under a protective classification, that is novel. That is new. And it's also very concerning, because it seems to be an assault on the idea that anyone has a inherent right to be in the country, right? I mean, we see it dovetails uncomfortably with the move to eliminate birthright citizenship, which is, in a way, an attack not only on the immigrant communities or on the idea of immigration, but further an attack on the idea of citizenship, right? And the notion that anyone has it's an attack on the concept of rights, right? That there are limits to the way the government can behave toward really anyone, right? Like people who moved here, people born here, that it leaves in the control of the authorities to determine who has rights and where those rights extend, rather than the rights being inherent into the person or built into the circumstances.
Yeah, I think another big overarching question a lot of people have, and this kind of relates to like how you've talked about over the decades, the police have responded to protests and crowds in different ways. It really does seem like this is a return to more aggressive, combativeness to demonstrators. I mean, it was interesting to see sort of the more hands-off approach to the No Kings protests, which of course a lot of those organizers, worked closely with police.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. I'm just curious your thoughts on seeing those dynamics play out. It seems like we are seeing law enforcement very giddy at the thought that they are sort of off the leash, even more so than they were before.
Right. Well, for about the last 20 years, the dominant strategy for crowd control in the United States has been what scholars refer to as strategic incapacitation. And this relies on an approach that draws distinctions between demonstrators who are, as the scholarship puts it, contained, meaning they operate within some very well understood boundaries, and demonstrators that are transgressive. And so the contained demonstrators tend to be more mainstream. They tend to be older. They tend to be attached to established political organizations. They tend to engage in lawful demonstrations, often working with a permit process or negotiating with police ahead of time. Or if they are violating the law, they tend to do it in symbolic ways that are clearly matters of civil disobedience that often, again, are negotiated with police ahead of time. Disruptive protesters tend to be younger. They tend to be less attached to political institutions. They tend to have more radical demands if they're articulating demands at all, and they tend to behave in ways that are more disruptive. And so the task for the police becomes one of distinguishing between the contained, quote unquote, good protesters or the disruptive, quote unquote, bad protesters. And the strategy then is to facilitate and coordinate and channel the good protesters into symbolic, lawful, peaceful expression that has very little disruptive force or impact on the overall life of the community. And to respond to the disruptive, quote unquote, bad protesters with just overwhelming force to prevent those from even getting off the ground. Now, I think one of the things that we're seeing at present is that the distinction there, so there was always a tendency to view people of color and working class or poor people and their political action as sort of inherently disruptive, inherently violent, inherently threatening, right? There's always been that tendency in policing. But I think we're seeing a distinction along racial and class lines that's a lot more pronounced than where it's not even necessarily anything that the demonstrators are doing that brings the coercive reaction. It's simply who they are and what they're demonstrating about, right? And in a way that very much goes, that does cast us back into sort of the bad old days of how police responded to civil rights demonstrators in the 50s and 60s. Now, the thing that, and I'm sure that there's something cathartic about that for authoritarians, but the thing that they may be forgetting is that the cops moved away from that model for some very good reasons, which is that the harder they came down on the civil rights movement, the more popular the movement became. And that while they could militarily break up as many demonstrations as they wanted, politically, it meant that they were constantly losing support. And that translated into growing support for the nonviolent wing of the civil rights movement. It also translated into the development and then growing support for the militant armed wing of the civil rights movement. And it meant that the policing lost credibility nationally in a way that it has never quite recovered from. So there's some short-term tactical advantage to just using overwhelming force, but there are some long-term and even just medium-term political consequences that make it ultimately self-defeating.
I'm curious, what do you think right now about the growth, and this seems to have been building since 2020, and this largely comes from liberals and progressives and a lot of, online boomers, I guess, to put it nicely, of viral conspiracy theories that largely are on the left, definitely amplified by the right and sort of like feeding off of old right-wing tropes of outside agitators and stuff like that. We saw with the No Kings protest, there were just a lot of people that were convinced that there were going to be Proud Boys that would, I don't know, dress up in like, pussy hats or something and like trick people into making Trump bring down martial law. What do you think about that? Because a lot of that seems to be like internalized fears, but also just sort of internalized ideas about the way that protests should work, that you've got to follow the rules this way or else they're going to do this, and we've got to like show people that we're good and that we follow the rules, or else they're going to bring all hell down upon us. Like how do we sort of maneuver with so many people that are new to protesting, which is good? We want to bring new people in, but how do we deal with those just viral?
Okay, so you articulated something that we can think of as the agent provocateur thesis. So the idea is that police will hire agents to infiltrate political movements and move them toward violence with the idea of discrediting those movements. And this is not a crazy thing to think, because this has happened. And it's happened in the relatively recent past in some demonstrable ways. It's not, however, a a standard response to demonstrations, right? Like it has tended to happen in fairly marginal ways, and it is never really the driving force behind militancy in a demonstration. It's also, in the cases that we know about, has generally been used for the sake of like setting up particular people on criminal charges, rather than the idea of like creating, widespread disorder for the sake of declaring martial law or anything like that. There's just not evidence of it happening at that scale.
Yeah, just to interject, I can literally think of no example of somebody in like a protest situation that was somehow, either like a confidential informant or somebody that was like some sort of law enforcement agent in any capacity, like doing something illegal for the, specific purpose of like escalating a situation. And in fact, I mean, this is where I think like the example with Eric McDavid and the, the person that was working for the FBI in that entrapment case is very instructive, because the way that they basically graduated up to entrapping McDavid and several other people was that they started off as somebody that met an FBI agent in a college class because they went undercover to write a story about a protest. And then they became basically somebody that continued to do that and then reported back to the FBI. But what they were doing was that they were alerting them to the movements of protesters at various demonstrations. And then law enforcement would then use that information to then stop them doing like things like street blockades and stuff like that. So it was actually, they were having the opposite effect of what sort of this agitator conspiracy is based around. They were actually using information in real time from informants to stop the ability of protesters to be disruptive, as opposed to amplifying that in order to then justify state repression. The repression was actually stopping people from protesting, essentially.
And even cases that have more of a superficial similarity to the conspiracy theory, like, for example, when Brandon Darby convinced a couple of kids to make Molotov cocktails ahead of the Republican National Convention, the point was still that the police intervened before those things got used, right? So that set them up for the situation where they could be, arrested and convicted of making the bombs, and then that could be a headline of like, brave police save the city from anarchist arsonists. But the point was never for them to, the point was actually seemingly from anybody's side was never to use the things, right? And so again, the idea was that it was going to create this narrative of brave police versus dangerous anarchists, but for the sake of chilling the demonstrations, not for the sake of escalating them. So, I think underneath all that, like the reason that this narrative takes hold, you're absolutely right, is because people have a particular kind of idea of how demonstrations are supposed to be. And they have a particular kind of idea of like the I don't know, the values, the morals that animate a social movement. And that idea is largely based on a misremembering of the civil rights movement. And then they see anything that varies from that, and they immediately think that it is, that like, well, those people are doing it wrong. And furthermore, they don't think that they could just have a difference of opinion about like what acceptable tactics are or how social change happens or anything like that. There's a tendency to sort of naturalize one's own perspective and assume that that is the obvious, like, agreed upon understanding of how politics work, and therefore to assign nefarious motives to anyone who breaks from that kind of orthodoxy.
One other thing I wanted to ask you about is just how, we kind of already talked about this, but it seems like so much of the plays that Trump has made, and this is kind of what's taken me aback, is just how much these moments are sort of produced for like Fox News consumption or viral moments and stuff like that. I'm thinking like maybe one of the best examples is when they were loading people onto planes and they put shackles on people and they called it ASMR and like different posts and stuff like that. Like very much like, we're trying to trigger people essentially by like showing how, look at us, we're run by Nick Fuentes trolls. Like we're just so horrible and despicable. And again, I think there's a question of just like, isn't that turning some people off? Does that signal sort of like where they're at in the fact that they don't seem to give a shit? Or is that like a miscalculation on their part that they actually are, failing to sort of manufacture consent in a certain way?
Yeah, well, that is, I don't know, the postmodernist one. And this is what we're left with. Like the Trump personally, and a lot of the people in his orbit seem weirdly indifferent to consequences, right? They seem really not to care what the effect of their actions is. It's like, it's all purely expressive, right? And so, which is one of the things that fuels the kind of the chaos that we were talking about before, right? Where it's like, they don't need an immigration policy that's going to, actually control immigration or regulate it in some way or, balance competing interests in a real way. They just need to be seen doing something that presents the kind of image that they're looking for. And it's a similar sort of thing with the tariffs, right? It's like part of why they could not articulate a coherent objective that the tariffs were trying to achieve is because really just the objective was to be seen enacting tariffs, to be seen doing something that seemed decisive and like unthinkable a year earlier, right? And so it's all a matter of creating this sort of a particular kind of persona and a particular kind of like self-presentation. Now, the question of, I think fundamentally the question is who are those displays of cruelty supposed to appeal to, right? And whether they're turning people off or not, I think remains to be seen. But they're certainly not attracting new people, right? Like people who were like kind of ambivalent about like, it's like, well, who had like anxieties about like the economic effect of immigration and whether it depressed wages or took jobs or anything like that, but who also were like, but on the other hand, like the people need to make a living and like a lot of people have been here a long time and whatever. They're not going to be won over by the display of cruelty, right? Whether people who are expressly xenophobic, expressly nationalistic, anti-immigrant, or those kinds of reasons will be turned off when they see the cruelty that their worldview implies. That's a different question. Right now, I think it's too early to tell. But the question of like who it is meant to appeal to is I think an interesting one, because again, it's like so much of it is Trump trying to like maintain the adoration of his base, but seemingly indifferent to the actual consequences, sometimes even for himself.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I think a huge cornerstone of, what makes MAGA is being able to sort of like take working class anxieties about the economy and work and capitalism and try to shove them into, culture war, white supremacist talking points and try to sell those things.
Right.
Definitely like the way that they've been able to weaponize fear of people, whether it's trans people, the left, Antifa, whatever, especially immigrants and crime. I mean, they've done spectacular job on that. And I think what's interesting though is that that's, they've kind of run out of political capital. Like you said, they're just going after everyday working class people, which is interesting too, because it shows that, a lot of people want policies that just aren't on offer from either of the corporate parties. People want actually like a left-wing position, which is that people that are here, that have been here a long time, that are part of our community should, be given full citizenship and able to form unions, better wages, bring them out of the shadows of the second-class citizenships that allows them to be hyper-exploited. And of course, both parties aren't interested.
The shared goal of both parties is basically to maintain that sense of stratification so that there is a like hyper exploitable labor force, right? And then the where they differ is how they intend to enact that. And one of the divisions within the Trump administration is between people who are on that sort of standard bipartisan consensus versus people who like are expressly white nationalists, right? Who for them the purpose isn't to like maintain a overexploited labor force. It's just to push people of color out of society altogether. And we're seeing the contradiction there play itself out as, with astonishing speed, they moved from, targeting people who were undocumented and also had like an arrest or a criminal conviction to just people who are undocumented to people who are documented, right? And then, with their additional aim of undoing birthright citizenship, right? So that's happening. And then, one of the places where Trump is maybe walking that back is because people in those industries that depend on those workers are like, wait a minute, we now don't have anybody to like bring in the crops or clean hotels. And, those two aims within the MAGA movement are importantly at odds, and trying to keep both of those factions happy is going to prove to be very difficult, I think.
One last kind of big overarching question, like in this moment where all these political institutions are being debased and in people's eyes, legitimacy is running low. I'm curious, what does that mean for those of us that want, a radically different set of social, economic, and political arrangements, especially as, things get so scary. I mean, I think, you brought up the bringing of the National Guard. I'm thinking also of like sending hundreds of people to CCOT, I think was another big turning point. Just a couple of days ago, the United States attacked Iran. And again, like the way that the media and the Democrats frame this is all, illegal. Instead, it becomes this, they didn't go through the right channels, not as opposed to like this is an authoritarian, hugely draconian, horrible set of policies that is enriching and strengthening like a horrible group of people. I don't know. I mean, like as more people sort of recoil, I think the question is like, what does that mean for those of us that, do want to actually see these institutions abolished or gotten rid of, something else?
Yeah, I mean, it's a funny place to be, because it's like, yeah, I also want to destroy the state, but not like this. I mean, I think from necessity, we are going to need to step up our game in terms of building counter institutions, right? Like as as our already anemic welfare state is just completely bled dry, we're going to need to find other ways of making sure that people have their needs met. And that is a tall order, especially because we're going to have to do that at the same time that we're, resisting the coercive force of the state in the form of, at present, mass deportation, and trying to stop yet another forever war, and trying to force some sort of action to slow the deterioration of the natural environment. Like there's a lot on the agenda fairly urgently right now. And one of those things is going to have to be building different kinds of organizations, creating new institutions that are going to help people survive in the meantime. Of course, that's always been part of any really serious radical political movement, that at some point the legitimacy shifts away from the state and toward the political movement, and people stop looking to the government to provide for their needs and start looking to the movement. And the movements that are prepared for that shift tend to do better in the long term than movements that are caught off guard when that happens. A thing that's weird about our present moment is that seems to be being just thrust upon us rather than coming as a development of the movement gaining strength, right? It's like the government is just abdicating responsibility, which is going to result in enormous human suffering, but also is likely to be self-defeating, because the reason that states took on welfare functions was mostly not humanitarian. It was mostly that it provided them legitimacy. And when they give up those functions, then they're just giving up a major source of their legitimacy. In the long term, I don't think that's a plan that really works out.
Yeah, it just seems like they're hoping to kind of plug in the gaps with more repression and more propaganda. Like you said, the creation of welfare programs was a way to ensure social peace. If people aren't being fed or housed, or there's not basic standards, then they're going to riot. They're going to get bread by other means. And so, that's a good way of at least ensure, and at least having a conduit in which people can in theory address certain concerns, even if still sort of this, class domination essentially remains in place, that there is some democratic veneer. There's a way for people to redress and go about trying to implement changes, at least on the edges or aesthetically. And that seems to be just being thrown out the window. And yeah, where that leaves us in the end is anybody's guess. But obviously it's not popular. I think the big beautiful bill I saw was at 27% support. That's even underwater with Trump supporters, it seems like.
Right.
Well, what are you working on these days? Do you want to plug anything, or?
I am just about done with my next book, which will be a history of policing in Portland, starting with settlement and ending just after the 2020 uprising.
Interesting. That sounds really cool.
I hope so.
Where will that be put out at?
AK Press is publishing it.
Awesome. Does that have a release date?
It should be out early next year. I think February is what they're looking at present.
Do you have any big reveals you want to tease us with, or?
Not a question I had considered previously. In a way, this isn't surprising, but it still kind of shocked me that how regularly the same group of characters will recur over and over again across decades. And it's you can leave office completely disgraced as the mayor and then be the mayor's chief of staff 5 years later, right? And it's once you reach a certain status in society, you can only fail up. You don't actually lose that status. And so that's a theme that comes across in the book that surprised me as I saw it play out over a couple centuries.
Awesome. We'll definitely look forward to the book. That sounds great. And thanks for taking the time.
Yeah, good talking to you.
I'll be silent.
Okay, once again, we are graced with the presence of Vicky Osterweil, author of In Defense of Looting, and also a recent presenter at Socialism Conference, which I'm surprised about. I just see a back room somewhere where one of the organizers like, we're bringing the looting lady here. Like, what's going on?
Yeah, I did think probably it would be like the biggest collection of my enemies and haters that I had ever been around, but like it was all right actually. There were lots of cool, nice people there. Hi,
Awesome.
Yeah, hello. Thanks for having me.
So we're going to be talking today. This episode has a couple interviews with people talking about logistics of policing, counterinsurgency, ICE, and everything. Those were recorded before the bill, the so-called Big Beautiful Bill, was passed. Now it has been passed. We're going to be talking about sort of your reactions to that, thoughts, but also talking about Vicky's essay that came out in April, published on Collective of Anarchist Writers, or CAW, which is a new project we encourage people to check out, talking about your thoughts on the Trump administration 2.0 and sort of the logistical shortfalls of their project and how social movements and people opposed to the current order can push back against that. And just sort of wanted to talk to you, like, how do you feel that holds up to today? Do you feel like the arguments that you were making then still hold weight? But let's start off in talking about the bill. What are people's thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, when we were talking about the bill, there was always this question of what was actually going to be in it. That there was sort of a distortion of what the normal budget reconciliation process was. And there were a lot of things that were going into the bill that ended up not being in the final version. Now that we can see the final version, I think that there's a couple of things that we have to sort of keep in mind. The first is, what are budgets, right? Budgets are, in political science talk, we'll talk about them as statements of intent, essentially, right? It tells us what an administration wants to do, not what they're going to do necessarily, but what they want to do. Now, traditionally, that is supposed to be what they're going to do. But as we know, with this administration, things like congressional oversight of funding is not necessarily a high priority. And so it gives us a statement of intent. And what does that tell us? Well, it tells us that what their intent is exactly what we've been saying, I think, on this show, and I think what people like Vicky have been saying for a long time, which is that the goal here is about creating a state which is capable of engaging in domestic repression, right? To create a state that is capable of consolidating power in an executive branch, to create a state that is capable of having centralized authority in an American political system in which power traditionally is very fragmented, right? It might not feel that way sometimes, but if you really look at the many, 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 many layers of American governance, politics here is deeply, deeply fragmented. So it tells us that they are willing to cut back social services and boost up domestic policing, right? This kind of Schmittian concept of the state that we had talked about sort of maybe in December, January, February, where on this show we were talking a lot about how if you really look at the core of what they're doing, it's a sort of extreme neoliberalism, right? This kind of idea that what the role of the state is to essentially use force to guarantee the stability and profitability of markets, right? And then to create as much market space as possible. I think that the budget is very much in the direction of intent, sort of indicating that that's where they're going still, right? You see this with the increase in the Homeland Security budget. You see this with the increase in the ICE budget specifically. But I think the other thing to keep in mind, and this is sort of the counterpoint, that doesn't mean that those things will happen or that those things will be effective. The kind of liberal freakout that's happened over the budget is that, oh my God, we are now in fascism, right? Not in a process in which authoritarianism is consolidating, but we are in fascism because they have stated the intent essentially through the budget to do that. But the reality of that is, we've been saying this from the beginning, and I know we'll talk a lot more about this on this segment, but the reality of that is that dictatorships take a long time to consolidate. They take a decade plus in cases where it's successful to really consolidate. And those are in places with, political histories that have much more of a sort of affinity for authoritarianism, that have stronger political parties, that have much less fragmented structures of governance. It takes a long time to do that. Even in a small place like, say, well, not small, but comparatively small, like, say, Turkey, right? Or in a place that is geographically as large, but population-wise much smaller, like, say, Russia. Dictatorship took a long time to consolidate in those places, and we have to keep this in mind. So we can take an intent from this, and I think that that needs to steer strategy, that needs to steer our analysis, it needs to steer how we read what they're doing. But what we can't do is fall into the trap of, say, throwing our hands up and going, well, it's fascism now, we're done. Because all that's happened is that we've caught their intent. But we haven't caught the reality of that situation yet. Like, we are still very much in the midst of that fight.
Just from a pure theory perch, push back a little bit on the neoliberalism intensified, because I think one of the key components of neoliberalism and neoconservatism, as it adjusted it, was an insistence on free trade and global markets and using them effectively. And I think one of the things that is both so chaotic and has presented a lot of opportunities, but also is fundamentally different about Trump, even Trump 2 versus Trump 1, is like the really pure isolationism, the tariff stuff, which, you know, is starting to hit but hasn't fully hit yet. And I also think that from a perspective of, like, you know, from a neoliberal perspective, like, part of what you're trying to do with neoliberalism is, like, do a lot of nice talk about democracy and diversity and plurality. That's really, really important for neoliberals. And, you know, I think that this administration is pretty insistent on, needless to say, on not doing any of that. Even the most basic sort of hat tip to the existence of racism and racial capitalism, like DEI was, right, which is a very bare minimum thing, is anathema. They cannot abide it. So I think that on the one hand, and I think that part of what's happening here is this constant duality, just like you were saying, Tom, about intention versus can they achieve it. Like, I think there's this really important moment we're in now where there is real continuity, right? We are in a political process of solidification, policies that have been evolving and moving basically in one direction across every political moment since September 12th, 2001. Right. And, like, I think, like, we've been in this sort of long, slow, or maybe even the Brooks Brother riot in 2000, right? We've been in this long, slow fascist coup that is itself a consolidation of Reagan, that is itself, of course, a consolidation of white supremacist colonialism that was forced into compromises over a series of extremely intense struggles and you know, from, you know, the abolitionist movement and more, et cetera, et cetera. So those continuities are so vital, and if we don't look at them, and if we don't say, you know, as you both are pointing out, like, you know, these liberals are sort of like, oh my God, this is like a fundamental transformation of priorities for the United States. Is like, no, my friend, it is not. Also, it is something different. The absolute refusal to listen to courts, the absolute disdain with which it holds the economic apparatus, the trade apparatus, the disregard for legality, which was, after all, designed to make America the richest place on earth through soft and hard imperialism, like cultural imperialism, war, violence abroad, right? Like, there was, this system was built over, you know, 50 years at minimum to make America the most powerful, consistent, you know, global hegemon. That has obviously been collapsing already, but the fervor with which they refuse to participate in those parts of the international global order, the role of the U.S., like both from something like USAID, right? All of those things, like, they do represent a change, and they represent a continuity. And that's obviously confusing and weird, right? And so, like, we have to hold both of those things together. So similarly, in terms of that, I am terrified by what the bill does to healthcare in particular. I think that the Medicaid stuff is really, really scary. I think that healthcare has been the main angle of attack, counter-revolution, since 2020. You know, I think that the Biden administration really wielded COVID as a counter-revolutionary cudgel with extreme efficiency and effectiveness, and that has only accelerated under Trump. And I think that the attacks on healthcare and this and are terrifying, and people are going to lose their lives, and people are already losing their lives. Hospitals are already closing, right? It's a nightmare. And and we're living in this situation where they're about to find out why all of those things were put in place, like why the state does that. As you're saying, it takes decades to consolidate a dictatorship, and, like, they're just trying to, like, blitzkrieg the consent into place over 6 months without any real capacity for building the consent, right? Like a lot of people are saying like the manufacturing consent machine goes, there's like a joke going around, but like I don't think they're manufacturing consent anymore. I don't think that's an accurate description of what's happening.
No.
I was talking with Ayman Makadam, who's the host of like Politically Depressed on their podcast about this, and like, he was sort of saying it hasn't been that for the 6 months, and I think so. We are in something different, and it is the same thing it has been since 2001, since 1980, since 1492. And I think what is scary about the bill is precisely that it does, in fact, demonstrate, and if they can pull it off, it would be a massive reorientation of funds and resources towards pure internal repression. And also, they are already having extreme infrastructural problems doing raids on weed farms in California, right? And so, like, throwing money at throwing billions of dollars, like, multiplying the budget of a department by 10 times, like they're doing with ICE, like, as many people are pointing out, it would make it one of the largest armies in the world by funding. Absolutely true. Also, dumping money on an organization does not make it more capable. Like it has to materially scale up. It has to add staff. It has to find people willing to do it. And like, there's a theory here of some kind, I think, which is like you immiserate the entire population, and then like ICE agent will be the only job available. I think that's like there's a logic there of a kind, but it's really sloppy. It's going really fast, and it's really unpopular so far. So what I would say is like the bill was maybe the biggest material step they have taken towards really, 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 other than the Doge stuff, really, really ripping apart the foundations of society. It's a real big step in the war on society. And it's also a really, really visible and obvious one that leaves a lot of us with nothing left to lose.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I mean, you mentioned like the manufacturing of consent part. I mean, I feel like a lot of people that voted for Trump thinking that he was a populist, that he was going to lower grocery prices, there would be more buy-in for a lot of the repressive stuff if they actually delivered on improving people's material conditions, which I think a lot of people, thought that somehow he was going to do or wanted to do. And I think as time goes on, I think it's just more and more clear that not only was that a lie, but they're going to, in fact, make everybody's lives worse. Literally, like as you were saying, they're shuttering rural hospitals. People are going to be kicked off of healthcare. I mean, I think the best example of this is Trump's agricultural secretary recently came out and said, oh, well, it's okay that we're going to deport all of these working class farm workers that have been here for decades, that Trump was sort of mentioning that they might be given some sort of work program. She was pushing back on that after all of the right-wing talking heads like freaked out and said, no, we can't possibly have, amnesty for these people that have been here for decades and decades and do this integral job to the economy. We're going to deport them, but it's okay because all these people that are on Medicaid and Medicare that, quote, aren't working, which is actually not true. A large majority of them do have jobs or are working, or maybe they can't work because they have medical problems. We're going to put them in the fields and that will solve the problem, And also, we're going to fix the shortage with automation, so robots will just take it over. So, I mean, again, like it's just so clear, like what their vision is. It's attacking everybody, and you've brought this up too. I mean, that's one of their things. They're not actually giving one section of the population a little bit more of a sweeter deal. They're actually saying, no, everybody's fucked. So,
well, and like as you mentioned, like they're not improving people's like conditions, but like they're actually, and they're making them worse. But like all they had to do was keep them the same. So like in some ways, the thing that I think is like the most important like information chart was like this one that this Bloomberg guy released, which was like a chart of small business confidence from like 2010 to 2025 or whatever, and in 2016 to 2020, there was a massive spike, like 700% spike in small business confidence, right? So, everyone talks about Biden's vibe session, but like, no, Trump had a vibe bubble, right?
Yeah.
And if all the small businesses think they're doing better than they've ever done before, and if you work for one of those businesses, like you're going to believe your boss basically, or like, you're just going to hear him say that over and over again, right? Like that vibe is going to be good. So people thought the economy was better. when in fact it was largely contiguous with the previous, got a little worse, but it was like largely the same. So all Trump had to do was keep it the same and probably would have benefited from the same thing. But like day one, this tariffs thing, like, the car dealers, the real estate brokers, like like his base, like they're going to eat that fast. Like, and it's like, you can see it in that chart that the second administration, it starts to climb again, the small businesses, and then like around February 1st, when the cuts start hitting and the tariffs start getting announced, it falls off a cliff, right? So like they actually didn't even have to do that much, and they flubbed it. Yeah.
Well, and Vicky, I'm interested in your read on this kind of a thing. You brought this up. My late father used to always say this too, that, if they make the New Deal go away, they'll remember really quickly why they had it in the first place. Right?
Right.
You were talking about how there's clearly moves that are happening here which seem in contrast to the attempt to consolidate power, right? Gutting USAID, for example, killing the farms to food bank program, which was like a major farming subsidy for a lot of farmers in the Midwest, or, shutting down like the USDA office that helps facilitate farm loans, like real basic things like this. I've been trying to make sense of this myself. And, where I've kind of landed on this is that there's a combination of two dynamics going on, one of which is sort of ideology clashing with reality, right? Where it's sort of a dog caught the car situation. Like all of these people had all of these conspiracies about how everything worked, and then they ended up in charge and things didn't actually work that way. And now they don't know what to do. Between that and a war of competing factions, right, within the administration, between, kind of the AI tech sector, the kind of Christian nationalists, right, the Steve Miller kind of white supremacist, Steve Bannonite fascist types, right, and the various different projects that make up this administration. And that seems to be leading to some weird dissonances, right, where they're doing things like, for example, raiding a farm like they did in Ventura. The day before we're recording this, Vicky already mentioned this, but they raided a weed farm in Ventura, California, and it sparked a major riot on the highway, at the farm, things like this. And they had to bring dozens and dozens and dozens and dozens of agents out there to do that raid, which is expensive and which is not by any measure the most efficient way to actually detain and deport people. So we're watching these things kind of happen, which seem to be contrary to the way that a coherent, competent attempt at consolidating power would operate. And I'm curious as to what your read on that is. Like, why do you think that they're doing things that at times seem counterproductive to that overall goal?
Yeah, I mean, I think you could have done a lot worse understanding the politics of the last 10 years by just believing everything Trump said at face value. Like, you'd be wrong about some like details, but you would sort of be right about a lot more stuff than a lot of the pundits who sort of imagine that there's some sort of secret message constantly going on or that he can't possibly mean it. I think they really successfully. So I think in the first administration, I think that they thought that the resistance that they faced was genuinely driven by the Republicans, the rhinos, as they called them, Republicans in name only, which was like the center right to right wing Republicans who also understood how the Washington consensus worked, right? Who tried to maintain things in an orderly fashion, and the Democrats who tried to sort of, who used the hashtag resistance and tried to build off of the street movements. But I think in many ways, they really failed to understand what happened in that administration, which was that they had a very big street movement. We had a very big street movement. In the starting with the airport shutdowns, and even with January 20th, which was the sort of riot on his inauguration day that led to a big wave of repression against largely anarchists and anti-authoritarians. Those two things sort of fought the administration to a standstill. And in the intervening years, the administration the organization, the Trump movement, decided that those people who they could see were their real enemies, right? Whereas I think actually the Democrats and the Republicans who kept him reined in made him a legitimate figure in a way that he wouldn't have been had his sort of, most Bannonite desires or whatever, or just his most openly corrupt desires been allowed to flourish. So in the meantime, they have successfully captured the media, I think, totally. I think that the New York Times now is largely indistinguishable from like post 9/11 Fox News most of the time. I think they have like fully captured the media apparatus. They've also moved themselves entirely into, these media spheres of paranoia and conspiracy. and they have bought out everyone who resisted, and they've purged the Republican Party. This was an extremely effective tactic for squeaking by another electoral win, right? Because they were beating a Democratic Party that, I mean, the less said, the better. They were kicking in a rotten door, right, to get back into the electoral situation, and there was every opportunity to stop them, from January 7th onward, and none of them were taken, right? Okay, so the point isn't to litigate that so much, but to say that and this is sort of the thesis of the piece, is that they achieved what they achieved both in the first administration and again in this one without any real political struggle or organizing. If you talk about Erdogan or Putin or Modi, or even someone like Jobbik in Hungary, right? Like, or indeed in Italy, like that, their party there as well, who's now, an acronym is escaping me. Forgive me for not remembering all the fascists' names off the top of my head. Fuck them. I hope they all die and rot in hell, and I never have to think about them again. Okay, so those organizations, those movement leaders, those people went through decades of political organizing and struggle in a real way, in a real material way, that like sharpened some of their analysis of how the state functioned and allowed them to carry out internal structures within the bureaucracy of the state while also appeasing society to the extent that was possible, right? And repressing what wasn't appeasable. The Trump apparatus, never mind that Trump has lost his charisma and lost his sharpness. It's just a fact. Like the guy just doesn't have the juice anymore. He's not funny anymore, right? Like he just doesn't have it. Despite the rot at the top, they also purged all the reasonable people from the wings in order to, as one voice, squeak by in an election. And they did that. It was effective. It worked. So they just keep doubling down on that strategy, which is like purely image-based, purely media-based, purely spectacle-based. And that doesn't necessarily mean it won't be successful, because they do, in fact, wield the reins of power over the largest, most powerful empire in the history of the world. So it's not as though they couldn't make it work like this. But if you compare him, I do think the dog that caught the car is like the right thing. If you compare, these are the people who believed the lies that like the neocons told, right? And like the people around W, right? The Yale grad and like all those sort of, those classic, Washington insider types who pretended he was a cowboy. Like they made up a bunch of lies about the state, and they hijacked a lot of libertarian and far right fringe talking points about taxes, but they didn't believe it. And you can see it that they got into power and they just increased spending, obviously. And the Trump administration has a lot of people who really believe that stuff. They really think the universities are their enemies. They really think that hospitals are their enemies. They really think that the Democrats are their enemies. And it makes them ruthlessly effective at crushing things. And I do think they have, I don't see the path by which the current political and electoral system recovers. That seems less likely to me than any other variety of much more disruptive and upsetting situations and scenarios. But anyway, the ultimate kernel, I think, of that confusion that they experience is a genuine belief, conscious or unconscious, that America, there is something implicitly naturally true about America that means that it will be the biggest, most powerful country in the world. It will be the most important market, and it will always have control over this land mass, right? That the United States government will always control this continent. And that's because there hasn't been regime change here. It's, other than England, it's the longest running regime, right, on the planet. And so I think what they're doing is they're doing a lot of things that look like regime collapse. And if it were happening somewhere else, we would be like, wow, that's, that regime is falling apart. Not that that's going to be better. Not that means there's going to be like a victory for justice or the left. Like there are a lot of ways that things get worse while it falls apart, right? Obviously, we know our history well enough to know that, the Balkanization, isn't always like a good thing. That word doesn't like inspire a lot of confidence and desire. But also, I think a lot of liberals and even leftists and like people maybe listening to this podcast also don't believe on some level that the US could collapse, because it feels unimaginable, because it has been it's the center of a global system that is so powerful, and it has been for so long. And none of us in our lifetimes have lived through a regime collapse. And as you point out, like it's also an extremely complicated, it's huge, like geographically and in terms of population and in terms of market. Like federalism makes collapse really confusing. Like it's not clear what it would happen, like how it would reduce the states, et cetera. So I think there is a general and genuine belief shared by almost everyone, maybe in the world, and this is, propaganda and ideology, that the United States of America can't collapse. And I think like contra that, the constitutional regime is already over. I think it has already ended. I think we are in a new period. Again, that doesn't mean that period won't be called the United States of America. It doesn't mean that it couldn't be worse. But I think like when things are changing this rapidly and when they're going to war with society so aggressively at the same moment that their street movement is not, their street movement has left the streets. Like if y'all remember, like at this point in 2016, I think y'all probably do, like there was so much more street fighting with alt-right Nazis we had to do. Like where have the Nazis been, right? Like, I mean, obviously like on some level they have ICE, they have the government, they don't need it, but those folks are still around. In fact, he explicitly on day one said, I will pardon you, be my paramilitary. Where's his paramilitary? Like he has to fund it through ICE because like they're not actually in the streets for him. So none of these things are permanent. These are all descriptions of the current situation. And we are going to have to like hit really, really hard in many ways. But like, I think I've been saying since April, since that piece, that like an uprising was coming, that these contradictions had to lead to conflict because they are extremely effectively ripping apart the state in some ways at the same time that they're getting more and more effective at that at the same time that those movements are getting less and less popular politically. And I don't just mean in terms of polling, right? Obviously, like polling is whatever, but like, just on the street, like it's just not working for them. And so that's a contradiction that is leading to a confrontation that we are just starting to see in the ICE fight back.
Yeah, I wanted to ask, like, what do you all think about, there seems to be a consensus on the right. You hear this from Bannon, Charlie Kirk. I even just saw a clip of Nick Fuentes talking about this. I mean, as much stock as we want to put into these people, they were furious when Trump suggested that people would be given amnesty. And it seems like it's clear that the immigration aspect is like a core component of this administration's project this time around. Like that seems to be the big thing. And it seems like a lot of people, too, on the right are basically saying, like, well, as long as Trump does this with immigration, like, it'll all, like, I can stomach the attacks on Iran. I can go along with all this other stuff I don't like. They didn't release the Epstein files. Like, I guess I can roll my eyes. I wonder why. I guess I can go along with it as long as they do, these mass deportations. Yeah. And I don't know. I'm just curious, like how we see that. It just seems clear that that is the central project of this administration.
I think that there's a number of things going on there. It's become that for sure, right? I don't think that's where it started necessarily. During the campaign, they had kind of launched all of these lines of attack against, any number of different people throughout the kind of social space, right? And then when they got into power, they immediately weaponized all of that. And so you started seeing everyone from like, federal employees to, people receiving food stamps to people here without documents. There was this massive pushback, lawsuits, protests, things like this that happened at the beginning. At the same time that the Department of Justice was getting gutted, right? Both through cuts, but also people quitting. Where the FBI was getting gutted, both through cuts and people quitting, and Kash Patel threatening to shut down the national office. You've seen this all throughout the DOJ, where they just don't really have the capacity to fight back all of these lawsuits, all of these challenges, all of these whatever. And so what you've watched them do slowly is you've watched them kind of slowly drop certain campaigns, or at least push them into the background, right? Immigration at the beginning of this administration was really complicated, I think, because on one hand, as Vicky, as you said, they kind of cobbled this coalition together to squeak them over the line at the election. One of the things that happened in that moment was that they brought together the kind of far-right tech bro world and also the anti-immigration right, who have very contrary interests, right? And for a while, you saw this kind of very uneven approach to immigration, where they were talking about increasing visa programs over here, but then like deporting more people over here, and it wasn't necessarily coherent. One of the things I've noticed is as Musk left, as that initiative to shrink the federal government became less and less popular or got enshrined into the budget bill, the focus, the rhetorical focus, the operational focus is shifted back into immigration. And that seems to be the place where they're willing to sort of consolidate and make their stand. What that tells me is that we're going to see a bit of a shift in approach. That, if you read like the Project 2025 documents, part of the strategy is about casting this really wide conflictual net as sort of an attempt to fragment and overwhelm an opposition. And then, as the situation kind of consolidates a little bit, sort of focusing on areas where you're making headway. And so where are they making headway? Well, they made a lot of headway in the budget. They're making a lot of headway with immigration, right? Or so they think. Or they're at least making headway there more easily than in other areas. And so we're really watching a consolidation there. But I think that there's also a sense in which we're watching the politics of the administration define itself a little bit more clearly around that question. And they're taking a side in an internal debate within MAGA world, that they've sided with Stephen Miller over the sort of like AI tech bro set. And that's an interesting shift, right? They brought those people on just like they brought on the kind of crystal moms through RFK Jr. and the weird conspiracy theorists through Tulsi Gabbard. Like they brought all these people in to kind of squeak them over the line. But I think what we're watching is a contradiction get resolved. And so part of what that means is that it's likely they're going to be a lot more persistent with this, that we're likely to see them continue down this path until they run out of resources, because it really does feel like they have decided to stake their administration on this right now.
I guess the thing that I would ask in that question, and this is kind of leads to what I was going to ask, maybe is the last thing we talk about. But, again, we use this analogy of the dog that caught the car. I think one of the issues is that a lot of the people that sort of bought, there's the ideological fascist freaks that want mass deportations, a white ethno state. But a lot of the people that sort of went along with that bought the line that this is about crime. And if we get rid of, a couple of people with face tattoos that are in MS-13, then there'll be more stuff for me and everything will be great. And a lot of people are quickly realizing, no, this is actually an ideological project to purge non-white people from the country. We're going to go after all of the working class people that live around you, work with you, and for decades, like this is what we want. And I think a lot of people aren't down for that. I think the other question is that what happens when what we're seeing in Texas plays out, where you have, in theory, a conservative area that is coming up against the reality of the Trump administration, which is incompetent, isn't organized. They're coming up against logistical problems because of just the people that are in charge that are these bottlenecks, but also the fact that all of these agencies have been defunded and just are broken. So what happens in that context? Or also just with the budget bill, where you have people that are about to be absolutely wrecked because of healthcare and all these different programs being slashed. What does that mean for the terrain going forward? And I think the question for us is how do we interact with that? Because I think there is a real need to try to speak to people that are facing these new realities. So much of Trumpism is the idea that white people aren't going to get it like everybody else is, or straight white people, it's just going to be trans people. It's going to be immigrants. It's going to be whatever. And I think what we're seeing is that this is actually much more deeply ideological. I've said this before in other places, but Trump has been able to bring the GOP into his orbit, but also MAGA itself has been changed. It's a much more bourgeois Heritage Foundation project. We're excited about kicking people off of food stamps and Section 8 or whatever. And I think that a lot of people are sort of waking up to reality that now they're part of the target population. So I think, there's a real need to sort of interact with that and develop projects and organizing around that reality. And I don't know, I'm just curious your thoughts as we continue to see this play out in real time.
That's the question, isn't it? How are people going to respond? That's the $1 million question. I think to speak to one small point as a way of sort of working up to it, I think that a lot of those people who sort of voted for this and who are saying, I didn't vote for this to, whatever, be the guy down the street, they did vote for that. And on some level, they knew it. And I think what they are experiencing is the shame of what that actually looks like. right? So I think they're not down for it to the extent that, as you said, as you said correctly, they are not really committed to like the chasing of a white ethno state, but that's going to make them stay home. I don't think it's going to make them resist. So I think that like those people are never going to be the people we want to aim for. Those are never going to be the people we want to organize our imaginary around, right, or anything like that. Just saying that for that reason, not because I disagree with the analysis. That I do think a lot of them are like, whoa, that's not actually what I'm into, but only because it's too visible and it's too ugly, not because they don't like the theory behind it on some level, I think. And and that's whiteness, isn't it? But yeah, in terms of like the question of what's going to happen, I think that there are a lot of different scenarios that we could like sort of do on like a sort of in a sort of, I mean, I could sort of gloss some of them, right? I think like, you get a counter coup from the capitalists, although I think that's much less likely now that the Silicon Valley people have either kissed the ring or been sort of sidelined. But I think that there was, the possibility of a sort of Teal style, counter coup that gets rid of Trump and like, whatever, institutes some kind of, unity government between Vance and, Gavin Newsom or something. I think you could see a state pushed to the point of refusing to pay taxes or refusing the orders, and then Trump forcing the issue, and then having a sort of slow moving secession crisis, which would not look anything like the 1860 secession votes that happened, but would sort of, there would sort of be de facto dissolution of the state into autonomous regions that could then accelerate into civil war. I think Trump could literally just die or have a stroke or a coma, and then like who knows what happens. I think that there's a lot of different scenarios where an uprising really kicks off in a way that it leads to some of those scenarios I've just described, right? So I think like one of the things about the United States is it's so big, both population wise and geographically, that like you can't really just storm the Capitol in the same way that that traditional revolutionary imaginations work, even if that still worked anymore, which it never really did, and it certainly hasn't for a long time. But whatever, like I think like that sort of clean kind of revolution thing doesn't make a lot of sense. And also I think that that's a really likely scenario on some level, that revolution in its broadest sense, which is to say an overturning of the regime and its replacement with something else, is very likely. Whether or not what direction that comes from, I don't know, or what that looks like. In terms of what we can do, I think like, there's a few things. I think like morale is a terrain of struggle. Like I think like we have to not get stuck doom posting. I think it's really valuable that we think about things strategically, because I think, Tom, as you were pointing out at the very beginning, like the way in which there is this contradiction between every headline being really scary, but in aggregate it being really logistically ineffective. I think as people who are not trying to put our heads in the sand, but also not, we don't have any illusions about what the state is or about what democracy was before Trump. We don't have any illusions about what this settler colony born on slavery and genocide is. Something we can contribute to people is to say, yes, this is open fascism and authoritarianism. Yes, this is trying to build a dictatorship. And no, they are not achieving it yet. And no, this is not how they would go about doing it. And we can resist them now. And they have not clamped down. Like they had a perfect Red Scare in the Palestinian anti-Semitism stuff. There was this building Red Scare that like you saw universities like and liberal society like abandoning the helping turn people in and firing people and ruining their lives. And with the exception of some of the very scary deportations that were driven by like Canary Mission and like the whatever, like they have literally let that Red Scare fall apart. They didn't maintain it. There are lots of ways in which and they've disorganized the FBI. They've disorganized their internal repressive apparatus, and they're putting all that money towards ICE. Like they're sending ATF agents on ICE raids of sausage factories or whatever. Like that is not like that is yes, that is scary. Yes, that is an image of authoritarianism. Yes, that is an image of fascism, and also it is an extremely ineffective fascism. That like a lot of what the Nazis achieved was invisible to a lot of the citizens. Like the purging of the disabled, the T4 program, for example, was a secret. citizens, like they took people and they said, we're going to house them, we're going to get them through this economic crisis. And then they murdered disabled folks, right? But they kept telling those parents, oh, we're still taking care of them. Here's an update of how they're doing, right? They're doing everything as visibly as possible while being extremely ineffective. And like, that doesn't mean it won't work, and it doesn't mean it isn't fascism that they're trying to build. But what it does, it is something that we can point out, that we can leverage, that we can be thinking about, talking about, and building a movement about, that isn't about defending a status quo that wanted us dead just a little slower, but that also isn't pretending that this is perfectly contiguous, because if we pretend that this is an exact continuity with the previous, with previous experiences of government, we'll miss all the opportunities we're having right now. And if we miss those opportunities, then we won't be able to push for real power building. And some of those opportunities will be things like uprisings. And I think that we should be having, in small groups, in person, conversations about how our cities or our towns work logistically, and where there are important resources that are available, where and how we could move in a way to guarantee that, for example, what are moves we could make, either infrastructural that would build mutual aid and dual power, or infrastructural that would empty jails and destroy precincts and ICE offices. What are moves like that and targets we can have in our head, so that when things pop off, and they will pop off, we can help guide that energy towards doing real material lasting change, rather than just an expression, a discursive expression, rad though it is, of our anger and our rejection. So that's one thing we can be doing. And the other thing I think we can be doing is trying to tap into like building local networks as much as possible, because these disasters are happening. The healthcare is being taken away. This stuff is really scary, and the mutual aid networks that we started to build, that we've been building over the last 5 years, I think as a reasonable response to the lacks that were visible in the 2020 uprising, which was, we don't have these sort of material structures to really make this persist. I think we should keep doing that stuff. And I think we should think as radically and expansively about what is possible as we can. How can we give each other medicine? If they're going to close down our hospital, how would we keep that hospital open? Don't just ask that question. Sit down with your friends and really think about it. What would it require? Would you have to squat the hospital? How would you get pharmaceuticals? How would you convince the doctors to work there? If you had to get money, how would you fundraise? Maybe you wouldn't fundraise. Maybe you just take it over, right? These are real questions that we can ask that will help us get rid of some of the despair, some of the fear, some of the, Chicken Little, but that doesn't require us to pretend that nothing is happening, which I think has been it's a reflex I've seen a lot, of like, this is just the same as before. And like, that's just not helpful, because nothing is the same as before. Every situation is new, right? There's always continuity and there's always change. Right now, we're in a period of pretty accelerated change and pretty intense ideological continuity. And we have to hold that contradiction, that messiness, that confusion, and we have to carve paths with it, I think.
Thanks for listening to today's episode of The Beautiful Idea. News and analysis from the front lines of anarchist and autonomous struggles everywhere. Catch you next time.